All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Welcome to Anderson House here in Washington, D.C. My name is Andrew Outen, and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence, fulfilling the aim of the Continental Army officers who founded the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783 to perpetuate the memory of that vast event and to preserve the timeless ideals on which this nation was established. Those ideals, such as liberty, equality, freedom, civic responsibility, natural and civil rights, and the rule of law, have shaped our nation's history as well as other countries worldwide and are just as important and relevant today as they were at the outset of the Revolutionary War in 1775. Along with this evening's program that was made possible in part by a generous donation from the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, the Institute's work includes supporting advanced study, developing changing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating for historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that assist teachers, students, and scholars alike. Tonight's author's talk features Jeffers Lennox of Wesleyan University, discussing his new book, North of America, Loyalists, Indigenous Nations, and the Borders of the Long American Revolution. At the start of the Revolutionary War, independence had its limits as patriots were surrounded by indigenous peoples and loyalists throughout the northern regions that straddled the colonial borders. And these foreign neighbors were far from inactive during the Revolution. Upper Canada, Lower Canada, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and especially the homelands that straddled colonial borders were far less foreign to the men and women who established the United States than Canada is to those who live here now. Tonight, Professor Lennox will discuss how the participation of the loyal northern British provinces and indigenous nations that largely rejected the revolution as antagonists, opponents, or bystanders frustrated patriot ambitions, shaped the progress of the conflict, and influenced the American nation's early development. Jeffers Lennox is an associate professor of history at Wesleyan University, where his teaching focuses on indigenous settler interactions in early North America. His recent book, North of America, Loyalists, Indigenous Nations, and the Borders of the Long Revolution, explores how Canada influenced the American independence and the character of the early republic. Now, before I turn things over to Professor Lennox, there are a few housekeeping items for those of you joining us on Zoom this evening. Following this evening's author's talk, there will be a question and answer session. So please feel free to submit your questions for Professor Lennox using the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions, those can be submitted using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that, and they will do their best to assist you. Now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming to Anderson House, Professor Jeffers Lennox.
Well, thank you to the Anderson House and to the Institute for the invitation to come and speak to you all today, and especially thank you to Andrew and Ellen, who have provided me with such a warm welcome. For a Canadian, this is an intimidating place to give a talk about the American Revolution. I spent some time wandering through the beautiful house today, and I kept running into paintings of battles that I didn't think I knew well enough, and generals whose names seemed familiar, but I probably couldn't tell you exactly who they were. And at every corner, there's a portrait of George Washington silently judging me and asking what I'm doing here. But I am going to try to do justice to the American Revolution. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming this evening, and especially for the people who are tuning in on Zoom who are not directly related to me. I'm also grateful that you have decided to tune in. There are some family members in there. I think what I'd like to do tonight is talk about how I came to this project, and then to take you through a few episodes in the American Revolution, most of which you will be familiar with, but from a slightly different perspective, to tell the story of how the places that didn't join the rebellion and didn't become part of the United States were still active participants in the creation of the United States. I came to this project a while ago. It was when I was living in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I had a postdoctoral position there, and I was on the job market, and I was applying for jobs in the United States. And my specialty at the time was early 17th and 18th century Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And I realized I would have to convince American schools that I was a suitable early Americanist. And after a little humming and hawing, I thought to myself, well, I'll just tell them that I'm going to write a book about the American Revolution. And that should be enough. And so I was doing interviews at schools, and I came up with this idea of writing a book about the American Revolution, but how Canada was important to that process. And then I got hired, and I realized that they'd called my bluff, and I was going to have to carry through with this project. And it was helpful to teach students in the United States because Canadians cannot ignore the United States growing up. But what I've learned teaching here is that Americans can ignore Canada. And I thought to myself, that can't always have been the case. So what I was curious about was, at what point did Canada matter to early Americans? And since I had convinced myself that I was going to write this book, that's the question I went into the project looking for. How did it feature in the minds of early Americans? Not just the British colonies that didn't join, but also the Indigenous homelands on which those colonies were created. All these sort of limits to the American Revolution seem to matter a lot in the late 18th and early 19th century. And so that's what I have explored in the book. And I'd like to tell you a few of those examples this evening. So we'll start with the low-hanging fruit, the Declaration of Independence. This is not a document that you tend to associate with Canada. This is the founding document of what will become a new nation. But if you don't read that nation backwards, and you can put the Declaration of Independence in the context of its creation, it in fact has a relatively strong Canadian influence. We would have to go back a couple of years before the Declaration of Independence to the Quebec Act of 1774. This was a piece of legislation enacted by the British Parliament that essentially took Quebec, which they had captured a decade earlier, and had shrunk it at the time to a strip of land along the St. Lawrence River. French Quebec had always been claimed to be into the Great Lakes, into the Ohio River Valley, down to Louisiana. The Quebec Act then extended those boundaries back to what France had thought Canada was. What this did was not only increase the size of Quebec, but it also ensured that the residents of that territory, 70,000 of which were French Canadians, many thousands of which were Indigenous peoples, would be brought under some sort of British jurisdiction. But they made promises to the French Canadians in that act. They ensured that the French Canadians would maintain their French language, that they could practice their Catholic faith, that they could maintain their civil law, which is a slightly different form of law than had been practiced or was practiced in the British colonies. For British Americans, the Quebec Act mattered in no small part. I've got slides that I need to remember. It mattered because it seemed to be repeating the Proclamation Act. The Proclamation Act basically drew a line down part of the continent and said, British settlers can't go past this. This is land reserved for our Indigenous allies. This obviously infuriated British settlers who had fought wars to have access to the Ohio River Valley. The Quebec Act was sort of a sneaky way of bringing this barrier or this limit back. the British were relatively certain that British Americans would not be eager to move into a territory inhabited by French Canadians who could continue speaking French, could continue practicing their Catholic religion, and whose nearest neighbors were Indigenous nations who had long been allied more favorably with the French than with the British. After the Quebec Act, which tends to get lumped in to the coercive acts that are passed after the Boston Tea Party, it is in fact a different act. It's included because of the timing, but it had just been pushed in the schedule. It was supposed to be passed before the responses to the Boston Tea Party. But the timing of its passage mattered because British Americans lumped it in with these other acts that seemed to be penalizing them for their behavior. And so when the First Continental Congress is called, one of the first aims of this Continental Congress is to win delegates from Quebec. And so Congress drafts a letter in October, and it's the first of 3 letters that they send to the inhabitants of Quebec, inviting them to send delegates to the Congress and participate in this resistance to the British Empire. The first letter lays out all the rights that the Quebec Act is denying French Canadians, who are technically British subjects. They don't have an assembly. They don't have the right to trial by jury. There are specific things that seem fundamental to being British American that are denied to French Canadians. Now, Congress doesn't fully comprehend that those things don't really matter to French Canadians. They had never had an assembly. They kind of thought that trial by jury was silly. Their argument was, why would you have 12 farmers decide your fate when you can just pick one trained judge who knows the law? So they had their own reasons for resisting these calls. But the delegates are invited and none arrive. By May of 1775, after the shots are fired at Lexington and Concord, and after war seems increasingly likely to persist, another letter is sent to Quebec. And this letter reminds the people of Quebec that they have been invited to this Congress. It says, please come join with us in resolving to be free and in rejecting with disdain the fetters of slavery, however artfully polished. No delegates arrive after this letter either. At this point, Congress decides, if you're not coming to us, we're coming to you. And an invasion of Quebec is planned. General Washington had reservations about taking offensive actions beyond the 13 rebelling colonies. He wrote, to attack them, therefore, is a step of conquest rather than defense, and may be attended with very dangerous consequences. The revolution to that point had largely been fought over the demands of being treated like British subjects, and to attack British subjects for the purpose of expanding territory would put the Patriots on the offensive rather than the defensive, and Washington was aware that this would change the nature of the conflict. Nevertheless, an invasion of Quebec is planned and proceeds. They send Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold, whose career starts better for Patriots than it ends, into Quebec, traveling north from Albany. Arnold travels from Cambridge, Massachusetts, makes this massive push with his men. Montreal falls relatively easily, but Carleton and other officials escape to Quebec City, which is a fortress built on the side of a cliff on the St. Lawrence River. It's a terribly difficult place to attack. But attack they do. On the night of December 31st, 1775, Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold attack the fortress of Quebec. Richard Montgomery is killed very quickly and becomes one of the first martyrs of the revolution. Benedict Arnold is wounded and is unable to proceed with the conflict. And over time, the Patriot forces are ravaged by smallpox, and the entire endeavor is a fairly significant failure for the Patriots. After having attempted a military invasion, Congress returns to diplomacy, this time authorizing a commission to Canada. And they don't send the lightweights. The head of this commission is Benjamin Franklin. This is the trip where Benjamin Franklin gets his famous Martin fur hat. He spends about twice as long getting to Montreal than he spends in Montreal. His voyage up is sort of a litany of him writing letters to his friends saying he's probably going to die. He's suffering from the gout. He doesn't feel well. He has these sort of tongue-in-cheek goodbyes to people that he is writing. His colleague, John Adams, suffers a little bit of fear of missing out. He writes to his wife, Abigail, "I wish I understood French as well as you. I would have gone to Canada if I had." Adams always thought that he had a solution to a problem. This commission itself, although much confidence is put in it, is also a failure. Franklin wanders around the streets of Old Montreal for a few days and realizes that he's not going to convince any officials to join the American cause. He's been accompanied by Catholic priests or a Catholic priest and other Catholics who were tasked with convincing French Canadians that they would be treated well in the rebelling colonies if they decided to join. That's a difficult argument to make when there are other Catholic priests who had been run out of those American colonies who were taking refuge in Montreal. And ultimately, Franklin packs up and leaves. The other commissioners stay to try to help the army get a little bit more organized. But this is an unsuccessful venture. This failure in Quebec becomes common knowledge right around the same time that Thomas Paine publishes Common Sense. And it's not a difficult thing for readers of Common Sense to link the failed efforts in Canada with a call for independence. And in fact, in an open letter written to the author of Common Sense after the pamphlet has received much attention, one patriot declared, "Let it be the work of your Continental Conference to set the bounds to their claim as an associated continent, which ought to include at least the 13 at present associated colonies with those of Quebec and Nova Scotia." So the arguments here are overlapping, and people are able to read Common Sense, understanding what had happened in Quebec. Franklin, living through his time in Montreal, gets no respite when he returns and is very quickly put on the Committee of Five charged with drafting the Declaration of Independence. Now, Jefferson, who does most of the writing of the Declaration, is also busy with Canadian affairs. He doesn't get dedicated time to sit and write the Declaration. Pauline Maier describes how he pokes at it at his idle moments at his desk in Congress, as he is on committee after committee dealing with what went wrong in Canada and who is to blame for Canada. The Declaration itself obviously sets out the main arguments, which include this list of grievances that talk about Canada, talk about the fear of Catholics, the fact that the British government has created this big province on the backs of the colonies, and that the British government are supporting Indigenous allies to attack the British American colonies. And when the Declaration is published, many read it as a way to help mitigate the losses at Quebec and to promise a revenge of sorts. Abraham Clark, who was a New Jersey delegate, argued that the Declaration took some of the sting out of the Canadian debacle. He writes, "At the time our forces in Canada were retreating before a victorious army, our Congress resolved to declare the United States free and independent. We now must be," he declared, "a new independent state or a conquered country." Benjamin Rush was even able to imagine that new country's Canadian future, writing, "The banner of liberty will be planted on some future day by the states of America upon the walls of Quebec." So for many, the Declaration of Independence helps to put the Quebec failure into perspective and also provides a new goal for this revolutionary conflict. Now, the ideology behind what is happening is obviously very important, but there are campaigns being fought on the ground. And I'd like to look at one of these campaigns, a slightly lesser known campaign. And it demonstrates and challenges the patriot and loyalist claims to Indigenous homelands and helps triangulate the patriot, British, and Indigenous relationships that can cause some of these places to assume multiple identities. So the place that I'm talking about is what we would now call Eastern Maine. At the time, this was an amorphous geography, the land roughly from the Penobscot River to the St. John River in what is now New Brunswick. This is territory that historically was as likely to be oriented to the east towards Halifax as it was to the south towards Boston. More importantly, this was territory that had long been the traditional homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Welstakriak and Abenaki peoples. This was a thinly settled place in terms of European settlers. British Americans had pushed north from Boston and New England. French Acadians had long lived in the region and called it their own. And of course, the indigenous inhabitants of this land had never surrendered it and would continue to both claim and control the region better than either European settlements could do. But there were calls for invasions into Nova Scotia, and there were also warnings about invasions from Nova Scotia into this territory. Washington in 1775 and early 1776 was not eager to open a new front in a campaign, having just been part of a failed attack on Quebec. But late in 1775, Congress was at least interested in what Nova Scotia's response to an invasion might be. And so they sent two rather hapless spies, Aaron Willard and Moses Child, to go into Nova Scotia, take the temperature of the place, and report back. Willard and Child, by their own account, just crossed into the southern boundary of what they considered Nova Scotia. They weren't brave enough to go farther than that. They collected information from some locals, they made a few assumptions, and they reported back to Washington that Nova Scotia would probably be okay with being invaded. This was not enough for Washington to authorize any kind of an attack, but it did push Congress to think about how this territory would fit into the project of independence. And what Congress had to do and had to sort of learn to do effectively was to negotiate with Indigenous peoples. And so a conference was held at Watertown in July of 1776 in an attempt to win over the Wabanaki. This is sort of the name for the collection of Indigenous nations, the Confederation of Indigenous Nations that live in this part of the world. We know that the Indigenous nations had the power in this relationship because diplomacy followed Indigenous practice. And this was not something that most colonial authorities were very. Indigenous diplomacy requires days sometimes of ceremonial gift giving, exchanges, and wealth before any types of negotiations can take place. And there is a specific protocol, how you speak, who speaks, and when, that has to be followed. And the representatives of Congress did their very best to follow this diplomatic protocol. The Indigenous representatives were at this meeting. There were several of them, but two of them, Ambroise Saint-Aubin and Pierre Thomas, engaged in a discussion with the representatives from Congress and agreed that they would support the patriot troops. Now, when they were asked how many people they could bring to support, they responded, well, that's not really something we can say. We're not authorized to give you a number. Here is the challenge that Congress faced, which was understanding how Indigenous diplomacy worked. The deal that was struck at Watertown seemed like the end of an agreement for the congressional delegates, but was the beginning of a negotiation for the Indigenous delegates, who were then tasked with returning to their homelands and their own council fires, and to form some sort of consensus with other members and warriors of their nation. And no one was bound by an agreement. They could say yes or no, and at that point, they would have a better idea of who might be able to support the British. This was difficult because tensions were rising in this part of northeastern North America. Consequently, the conflicts in what would be called down East Maine had a different feel than other theaters in the war. Battles in and for the Northeast were less about an independent future and more about resolving a contested past with overlapping land claims and overlapping claims to authority. The Indigenous nations in this region had not surrendered their homelands. The British in Nova Scotia had pushed to claim larger areas for themselves. British Americans had started moving into Indigenous territories, and inevitably there would be numerous attacks in the region. Famously, Falmouth is burned by the British in 1775, but the British start having ideas themselves about what they could do with this territory. And they start dreaming of a colony that they call New Ireland. This was a project meant to reclaim from New England most of its northern parts and create an entirely new British colony to demonstrate the strength of British authority. An invasion is contemplated, planned, and eventually launched. In mid-June 1779, Brigadier General Francis McLean, aided by Captain Henry Mowat, who was reviled in the region for having burned Falmouth, leave Halifax and they land at what is now Castine, Maine. It doesn't take long for news to travel that British ships have arrived and are in fact building a fort region. And the Patriots, although they have very few resources and very little money, organize an amphibious force to respond. They send 39 vessels with 3,000 men, including Paul Revere. And this takes almost their entire budget. They're hopeful that this force of patriots will be able to remove the British at Castine, and it could not have gone worse for the Patriots. Every single ship that they sent was lost, either taken, sunk, or burned. The men made their way by foot back from the Penobscot, straggling in towards Boston, and Paul Revere himself was court-martialed for actions which tend toward cowardice. He was accused of spending more time on his ship protecting his personal property than on land with his men. And even worse, because he was the engineer in charge of ammunitions and the cannon. He was claimed to be a bad shot, which I think he took very personally. And it took him quite a while. It took him a few years to eventually have these charges dismissed and to be reinstated as a soldier or officer in good standing. So New England existed, but only briefly and only as an imperial ideal. It was a threat to New England, but it hearkened to this older imperial past. It didn't recognize the indigenous presence or past of the region, but it made clear to Congress that there were threats coming from the north that they would have to take seriously. As these northern battles gave way to southern campaigns, which surely became more famous, the war took a new turn, and with Cornwallis's defeat at Yorktown in 1781, a new phase began, which included very detailed negotiations in Paris to end the conflict. Franklin, having gone from Montreal, where he got his hat, back to Philadelphia, where he helped sign the Declaration of Independence, was then dispatched to Paris, both to win French favor for the conflict and eventually to begin negotiations to end the war. Franklin had been to Paris before. He was world famous there. And in his previous trips, he conformed to French sartorial styles. He wore the right outfits, he wore the powdered wigs. But when he arrived in 1776, he came wearing his marten fur cap and announced himself as Franklin the American. And it was this cap, this symbol of his time in Canada, that made sure that Quebec and the Northern Territory was never far from his head. He was part, eventually, of a peace commission aimed at securing the peace, along with John Adams, Henry Lawrence, and John Jay. Franklin was relatively quickly paired with Richard Oswald, a British diplomat. And Franklin made it clear to Richard Oswald that he wanted Canada. And he did this in a variety of ways. In the early stages, he suggested that it would be embarrassing if Congress demanded Canada from Britain and Britain then gave it to them. It would be much better for Britain if they volunteered Canada as a sign of good faith to make amends for the war that had been fought. Oswald was good at encouraging Franklin, keeping him talking, keeping his hopes high, but he got tired of this insistence on Canada. He, in August of 1782, and at this point you can almost hear the fatigue in his voice, he says, "The Dr. Franklin at last touched upon Canada, as he generally does upon the like occasions, and said there could be no dependence on peace and good neighborhood while that country continued under a different government, as it touched their states in so great a stretch of frontier. I told him I was sensible of that inconvenience, but having no orders, the consideration of that matter might possibly be taken up at some future time." Jefferson takes him, or Franklin takes him at his word. But there is lots to deal with in this peace negotiation, and Franklin is really the only one pushing for Canada. As his health falters, as the negotiations reach their end, Adams and Jay take over, and they're much less interested in winning Canada and much more interested in hammering out a peace that will end the conflict. But as Franklin's health returns, he has enough time, as various versions of this treaty go back and forth across the Atlantic to be debated and discussed as they make their way towards the final version, that he starts writing about some of the articles that he hopes he'll be able to write in to the final version. At first, he wants to add the concession of Canada and Nova Scotia to the Confederation. He is eventually convinced that this is unlikely, so he settles, and he says that the treaty might state the provinces of Canada and Nova Scotia declared free and independent states and at liberty to join Confederation or the Confederacy or to remain separate. So Franklin doesn't give up on this idea of somehow winning Canada. But with the war's end and with the peace, a new project begins, and that is the project of how to convince 13 now independent states to see themselves as something more than the sum of their parts. And there are figures in this story that take that as one of their main focuses. This is Jedediah Morse, and he decided to put his talents towards geography and textbooks. Morse is considered the father of American geography, and his textbooks helped Americans fashion a sense of themselves over time and a more national identity. One of the unique things about the way that Morse undertook this project, however, is that his version of American nationalism and identity demanded a deep engagement, understanding of places that were not American, that did not join the revolutionary cause, but nonetheless showed the birth and limits of the nation that was being constructed. He was aware that in 1783, the Articles of Confederation had a loose association of independent states. The states remained sovereign. This central power had been given enough authority to help run the war, but it certainly was not seen as the end of the process. And the Articles of Confederation had some parts that are familiar to those of us who are more familiar with the Constitution. There were rules about how new states could join this confederation. A new state could be added if at least 9 states agreed, but there was an important exception. Article 11 stated that Canada can join whenever it wants, no questions asked. So even in this early stage, Canada was seen as a possible addition to this project. Morse's textbooks have to sort of respond to these demands and ideas. His textbook, one of his first textbook, written in 1784, right after the end of the Revolution and the peace, was called Geography Made Easy. And it was illustrated by Amos Doolittle's map of the United States of America. Now, you may recognize that this is not just a map of the United States of America. This is a map that includes Nova Scotia, Canada, and Indigenous homelands. These places are colored in ways that make them virtually indistinguishable from the rest of the rebelling colonies, and they are covered in just as much detail as the rebelling colonies. In 1789, Morse authors another textbook, this one called The American Geography. And this is a book that gains wide reception and high praise. George Washington himself writes to Jedediah Morse to praise him for this project that's helping Americans think about themselves as something together. And in this book, readers are forced with taking a tour of the American states, but they are also invited to wander through the British provinces, which admittedly are given smaller sections. Vermont gets a little bit extra because it's a bit more American than the Canadian provinces at the time. In Jedediah Morse's description of Canada, there are words that would be recognizable today. Quebec is described as frozen and barren. Morse also discusses the political reality of Quebec. He notes that there is no assembly, that it is ruled by a military governor. This allows Americans to start understanding themselves by their differences from the places that are to their north. In 1793, Morse authors The American Universal Geography. And this one says right on the title page, calculated for Americans. But the organization of this book had changed. No longer did the states come first? Readers would first be taken on a tour of the British provinces before getting to the American states. And Morse's interpretation of those provinces had also changed. He noted that Quebec had been divided in two by the Constitutional Act of 1791, which created Upper Canada and Lower Canada. Both of those places had an elected assembly. Even the weather had gotten better. Morse describes the healing properties of the cold, how easy it is to travel by sled on the snow, how happy Quebecers seem to be in the winter. And as a staunch New England Federalist, Jedediah Morse seems to recognize more of what he likes in Canada, even when compared to the Southern American states. He realizes that Loyalists that had fled the Revolution and moved to the Canadian provinces had secured for themselves a lot of the demands that had initially driven British Americans to rebel. The government was treating them better. They had more say in the way that they were governed. And so Jedediah Morse is, of course, a father of American geography and responsible for crafting a sense of nationalism. But he, like most living in independent colonies and later the United States, lived in a world where it was often expected that one would look beyond the nation's border to help understand the nation itself. I'm going to skip that one. I would like to finish with the West and the War of 1812. Jedediah Morse got Americans into the beginning of the 19th century, and he had started a project of understanding American nationalism. Jefferson himself had his own project for American nationalism, and he looked west, and he saw a continent ready for expansion. But Jefferson was himself inspired by British movements leaving from Montreal. Alexander Mackenzie had traveled to the West Coast overland, leaving in 1792 under the authority of the Northwest Company. He reached what is now Bella Coola, British Columbia, and using a mixture of Vermilion and grease wrote Alexander Mackenzie from Canada by land the 22nd of July, 1793. The words themselves were ephemeral, the chosen medium, incapable of withstanding the elements, but their impact reverberated from the Pacific Northwest to Montreal, to London, and eventually to a neoclassical plantation house just outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. Mackenzie's voyage was published in the US in 1802. Have you seen Mackenzie's account of his journey across the continent? Wrote Caspar Wister, a Philadelphia physician, to Jefferson. The idea of a West had certainly been planted. After the United States secured Louisiana, the Corps of Discovery undertook their work, and they brought with them evidence of the British traces that they were following. Mackenzie's voyages from Montreal outlined the importance of the Pacific Northwest and named the Columbia as the primary river to gain access into the interior from the Pacific. Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark. They relied on maps and narratives created by British traders working for West Territories or the Northwest Company, including Alexander Mackenzie and also David Thompson, who had mapped much of the western part of the continent and traveled far farther with his Indigenous wife than Lewis and Clark had ever traveled together. On the 3rd of December, 1805, 12 years after Mackenzie had arrived, William Clark imitated the British explorer by writing on a pine tree, Captain William Clark, December 3rd, 1805, by land, United States in 1804, 1805. Politicians in the United States envisioned a nation stretching to the Pacific, but that vision was in constant competition with and inspired by British trade interests with similar plans. Before the United States could expand west, it would again attempt to push north. The War of 1812 has a different meaning in Canada. This is the war that we learn about. This is when we get to say, we beat the United States. But this is always a regional interpretation. The story is not the same on the West Coast. The War of 1812 is very much a Southern Ontario, Quebec, and maritime conflict. And I'd like to conclude my talk with just a few words on this war. It has been described as a civil war, and families were certainly divided. For example, Benjamin Rush fretted to John Adams about two of his daughters, both of whom had married British soldiers and were stationed in Canada. He would remember toasting the King of England at one of his daughters' weddings. He worried what would become of his family. The cause of the war was confusing then and now. I have to explain to my students each time that they're pretty sure why they were fighting, but it required some mental gymnastics. Surely there was impressment at sea. There were British restrictions on American trade, and there was the American desire to expand. Every Canadian knows one thing about Thomas Jefferson, which is that he declared taking Canada in the War of 1812 would be a mere matter of marching. But convincing Americans to go to war was not so easy. And here again, we have the influence of what was happening in the northern provinces. John Henry got himself involved. John Henry was a handsome Irish immigrant. He arrived in the United States in 1796. He could depend on his rich uncle in New York to provide him with some contacts. He married well, and he eventually started making the rounds of the upper-class Federalists in New England. After the death of his wife, he decided to move to Montreal and reimagine himself as a staunch Loyalist. He worked to convince members of the British government to employ him. That's what he wanted more than anything else, was a contract. And while he was able to secure influential friends in Montreal, some with power, including the Lieutenant Governor of Canada, called him an Irish adventurer, and even worse, a citizen of the United States. He wanted to prove himself, and he offered his services as someone knowledgeable about the United States. He argued that the Federalists were so upset with the Republicans that the Confederation might break apart. He traveled through the United States collecting information, hoping that his services would earn him an official post in Canada. He worked his connections. He was invited to dinner parties. He would remember what Federalists said at dessert after they'd had too much wine. And he would report back about attitudes towards Jefferson and these hints of unrest among Federalists. Now, he wasn't the only spy that the British government had. And in fact, he wasn't even the best. They were getting similar information from other people. And Henry was never able to secure the post that he wanted. He had to get creative. Fortunately for him, he had saved all of his letters. He knew that Madison was ready for war, but the public wasn't quite ready to support it. In December of 1811, Henry, now accompanied by a French swindler posing as a duke, made a pact on a transatlantic voyage to sell his letters for money to the American government. Negotiations took place as soon as they arrived, and Madison was very excited. Madison wasn't allowed to see the letters before he decided to purchase them, but he was promised that they contained evidence of British attempts to interfere with American politics. Madison ultimately authorized a payment of $90,000. This was not as much as Henry had asked for, but was all that Congress had available to spend. Henry embellished his letters a little, but there was still no smoking gun. But there was enough to push some of those on the margins towards supporting another war pitting the United States against Great Britain in 1812. So the War of 1812 was fought, and for the purposes of tonight, we can just say that Canada won. But the conclusion of the war did not sever ties between British subjects and American citizens, but it did mark both a beginning and an ending. The elite in Upper Canada still felt an affinity for New England Federalists, the Six Nations, and other Indigenous peoples maintained their transnational communities. And Blacks in Canada and on the United States in various forms of freedom and unfreedom worked to build relationships across a border that represented much more than a national dividing line to them. For many of these people, however, the border became increasingly national. Family members could live on either side, ideas could move across with relative ease, and commerce, both legal and illegal, persisted. But citizens of the United States now had to accept that the British provinces would never become American states, not by war, not by will, not by wishing. Neither a threat nor an ambition, the regions north of America, British colonies, and after 1867, Canadian provinces, developed in parallel to the Republic to the south, an example of a path not taken and a constant reminder that the failure to incorporate Canada during the Age of Revolutions shaped the creation of the United States. The promise of a continental nation was dead, and thus the United States would forever be limited by its limited both in its territorial and its conceptual identity. As Alan Taylor has argued, the United States was far from united before 1850. But after the War of 1812, American citizens and British subjects dealt with similar issues in different ways. Slavery, though not racism, was largely legislated away in the colonies by politicians and judges, even before Great Britain officially ended slavery in 1833. Tragically, the United States would nearly come apart over the question of abolition. The process of settler colonialism and violence against Indigenous peoples would also vary on either side of the border. The United States launched wars against Indigenous nations, and after fierce resistance, most nations were forced onto reserves from which they have continued to fight for their ancestral rights within the United States. In the British colonies and then later Canada, Indigenous nations were denied even the limited independence granted to nations in the United States and were forced into the status of wards of the state under the Indian Act of 1876. Like their kin south of the border, Indigenous nations in Canada have never stopped fighting against the state for reconciliation and recognition. As the United States and Canada developed over the 19th and 20th centuries, the gaze from one side to the other has reversed, as citizens in the province have been unable to ignore the states beneath them. Yet in the 18th and 19th centuries, American citizens looked beyond their borders, at times because they were greedy, but just as often because they were inquisitive. Their founding generation's relationship to Indigenous peoples whose homelands they hoped to transform and the British provinces along their northern border illustrates that forging a nation was an international exercise shaped from both without and within. Thank you.
All right, we will now take some questions if we have any from the audience.
Thank you ever so much. To your university students, when, like many Americans, we haven't really begun a real study of the history of Canada. Is there a particular volume or series, either old or new, that you would recommend for someone who wants to get their feet wet? And from the Canadian point of view of the rich topic of Canadian history.
So if I had to recommend a book for Americans, it might be 3 books, because that's what we do. But Alan Taylor's work has been excellent on this. I think what Alan Taylor has done is take Canada seriously and incorporate much of its history into this broader continental story. Now, if you want a history just of Canada, you can, there are so many that I'm having a hard time thinking of one. But authors, Champlain's Dream by Fisher, looks at the early history of Champlain in Quebec. John MacFarrager, from who's an American historian from Yale, wrote a book about the Acadians and Nova Scotia. The textbooks of Canada are sort of like the textbooks of the United States. They do a lot, but not very deep. But I think it's possible now to read historians that have a reputation in the United States who are now taking Canada seriously. So I think Alan Taylor's work on the colonies, and then he's got a book on the Revolution, and then he's got a book on republics, and his book on the War of 1812. It's difficult to write a book that he hasn't already really put a stamp on. So he's a great place to start if you're interested.
First of all, thank you very much. I was wondering when the two began to really be two nations, excuse me, when was the 49th parallel drawn, and who was it that actually got involved in that?
Excellent question. So actually, David Thompson on the right there, he mapped the 49th parallel, which becomes the border in the early 19th century. The problem with the peace of 1783 is it sets out a border that's actually impossible because the geographical markers it uses don't line up. So part of the project in the post-war era is to solve these border issues, and one of them is the border that will separate what is now New Brunswick from Maine. And that's not settled until, I think officially not until the mid-19th century, early to mid-19th century, in part because they know what river it's supposed to be, but everyone has a different idea of what that river is. And everyone can provide maps that says that their version of the river is the river. So it takes a while and an official commission to settle that. And the 49th parallel sort of comes into being as these states are pushing west, sort of at the same time that provinces are doing the same thing. But it's a border that they already knew existed because David Thompson had sort of mapped the line.
Thank you very much. How do the Canadians tell the history of how the War of 1812 began? What was the reason for that Canadian view?
It's American aggression is one story. It's an equally confusing war. You know, when it's taught in Canada, lots of books have been written about the War of 1812, and I was sort of tongue in cheek, but they've tried to make it Canada's American Revolution. We had a government a few years ago that spent millions and millions and millions of dollars commemorating the War of 1812 as a military founding, which goes against the story that Canadians like to tell themselves as this sort of anti-counter-revolutionary story. But it's about American invasion. It's usually about Indigenous resistance, and it is a story of coming together. It's a story where certain important battles, although without the British certainly would have been defeats, benefited from the French Canadians fighting with English Canadians, fighting with Indigenous nations. And so there is a story there of a founding of, a multicultural founding that fits into another sort of story that Canadians like to tell themselves about their multicultural heritage, even though this is a war after which the British realized they don't need their Indigenous allies anymore. After the War of 1812, it's clear the fighting between British provinces and American states is done. And Indigenous allies are cast aside, and a real process of land grab and settler colonialism takes place. So there's the friendly story about defeating Americans, and I mean I joke about that, but that is how it's taught. It's not given the complexity that the war demands, but it does allow Canadians to tell themselves a story with a founding moment that seems to include both the French and the English, and that's a really difficult thing because the French have a history of Canada that's a history of defeat, that's a history of loss and conquest, and the War of 1812 allows them to participate in a national founding that is useful for that kind of project.
Regarding the previous topic of the northwest border between the United States and Canada,
Mhm.
I remember from high school history the slogan 5440 or fight.
Yes,
I've forgotten who said it.
James K. Polk. James Polk.
James A. Polk.
Yeah.
And what's the Canadian view on it?
What is the Canadian
What was the Canadian view then on it?
of that demand? Well, they were not going to. They would fight. They were not going to give them 5440. I mean, there was certainly a demand or a desire to connect the Pacific Northwest to Alaska, and Canadians liked having British Columbia and the ports at Vancouver and Victoria. They did, you know, that is a place where there were these little conflicts in the 19th century between America to Swan Islands and if you look at the actual border between Washington State and British Columbia, it's pretty wonky because they included all these different islands. But they were, I think they called their bluff and managed to keep the border as it was.
Does this work? Yeah. I have a question about the Loyalists that fled just after the American Revolution in 1783 to Canada, or at
Mhm.
least always thought in France, especially the Loyalists fled to Canada.
Yes.
So I'm wondering how would they view the United States afterwards as when it became sort of really a nation, and then especially the 1812 war, were some of these Loyalists involved in that? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So here's one of the reasons that the Americans are confident about the War of 1812 is they're able to say, well, look, 40,000 people who are our kin have moved north, and we may be able to depend on them. And a lot of the British are worried, can we depend on these Loyalists? But there had been different forms of migration. There were the Loyalists right after the American Revolution, who made the active choice to stay British. But then there was another round at the end of the 18th century of late Loyalists, and these were American citizens who had won the revolution, who had fought for, they weren't going to be taxed without representation, and then as soon as they got representation, they got taxed, and they paid a lot for the tax that they had on their land. And the governments in Upper Canada and Lower Canada said, come on up here. We're not going to tax you like that. You're not going to have the same participation in your government. This is a much more conservative place, but we got all kinds of land if you want to come up. So there are a lot of Loyalists who feel like they got the deal that they wanted and were willing to participate. There were certainly some that were on the fence. There's, of course, a whole other story here of Black Loyalists. And that's sort of a real tragedy of the Loyalist migration is you have thousands of free Blacks who get to move into Nova Scotia. And then you have lots of enslaved Blacks that are allowed to come with their Loyalist owners. And so the reality for Blacks in Canada is those who came as free Blacks realize that they're not getting racism didn't disappear. They were pushed to found their own towns. They got the fewest resources. And then, of course, there are the enslaved Blacks who, ironically end up, the story we tend to think about is that enslaved peoples escape to Canada. There are lots of enslaved peoples who flee Upper Canada to go into Michigan because it's a free state, a slave-free state, or they leave Quebec because they can get into Vermont where there's no slavery. So that goes both ways. So the affinity to the British government, I think, is one that is wholly contingent on the reasons for remaining loyal, whether it's a true belief in the British government or it's an opportunity. And it, of course, splits along racial lines, as it did in the revolution itself.
I have a question about the burning of Washington and the perception that Coburn and Ross came here in retaliation for what happened up in York.
That is, I mean, I think that's certainly one of the reasons. That was a period in the War of 1812 where both sides seemed to be ignoring the rules of warfare. The burning of settlements in Newark in Upper Canada, which then led to a response in Buffalo. There are stories there of soldiers behaving in ways that they weren't supposed to behave as governed by the rules of war. And the attack on the White House, I think, is often seen as part of this moment where the guardrails of what is seen as acceptable warfare are starting to fall off, and people are doing things that they wouldn't normally do. I don't know if I have a specific a good citation as to whether the generals who were leading this thought that, but that's the story that is still told about the war, that there were these personal animosities and responses for perceived aggressions that cascaded into what happened with the burning of the White House.
At the time of the American Revolution, was the European origin population of Canada relatively much smaller, relatively speaking, than the population of the 13 colonies?
Yes, very much so. There were, I always tell myself I'm going to memorize these numbers. I think the population of the rebelling colonies was something around 1.5 million range. There were 70,000 French Canadians and a few thousand European settlers in places like Montreal. Halifax was a relatively small military garrison town, so dwarfed in size. And this is, part of what made some of the early American claims about the Quebec Act laughable, is because what they would claim is that we're going to be flooded with these Catholics. We're just going to be overrun by French Catholics. And you could throw anything and not hit anyone in most of the part that is Quebec, or that was, the expanded boundaries of Quebec. So the population difference is quite remarkable.
All right, well, we do have a few questions from our Zoom audience. The first one is, was there a concern from not Franklin in particular, but the American policymakers that were trying to bring Canada in and incorporate them? Was there a concern of a French culture influence and a language barrier, anything like that?
Initially, the argument is that French Canada will be welcomed. They do refer to the Catholic population in Maryland as an example of this acceptance. But over the course of the revolution, when France gets involved, the concern is that the alliance with France is going to lead to France wanting Canada back. And so it's more of an international concern for Congress and for American diplomats, that in exchange, even though the Comte de Vergennes says over and over, we don't want Canada, we don't want Canada. And in fact, they don't, because his attitude is, as long as the British have a foothold in North America, the United States will be dependent on France. And so there's sort of they have opposite concerns, and they're really not understanding each other very clearly. But the American concern is much more about France wanting to take territory back than the influence of 70,000 French Canadians who are already there.
Thank you. We have one question is, are there any connections, direct connections between the American efforts to draw Canada into the war and the British Treaty of Fort Stanwix?
British Treaty of Fort. So there's a couple treaties of Fort Stanwix. The 1784 Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which is probably the one that is being referred to here, was more an example of I think it had much less to do with Canada and much more to do with a new attitude towards Indigenous peoples that Americans had. This is an era right after the Revolution of forced treaties, where instead of negotiating with Indigenous peoples over what land they might be willing to surrender, the diplomats say, here's the land that you can have as a reserve. The rest of it is ours, because you're seen as subjects of Great Britain, not as allies that require their own peace. And that brings up, that leads to all kinds of conflicts with Indigenous peoples over the Ohio. But I don't see a connection there with trying to bring in Canada. I think it's more about establishing a new relationship with Indigenous peoples.
Great, thank you. We have one gentleman who is asking if you can offer any insight about Colonel John Allen and the Native Americans in Maine.
Sure. So many things I didn't include in this talk, but it's a good chance to talk about it. John Allen was sort of a patriot who saw himself as filling a role for Congress to negotiate with Indigenous peoples. And Congress believed that he could do it, but in my sense, he bites off more than he can chew, and he also doesn't fully understand the nature of Indigenous diplomacy. And he actually learns about the failures of the Watertown Treaty, because when he marches and invades what will become, what is at the time Nova Scotia, he just has a handful of Indigenous peoples with him and a few patriots who decide that they will participate, mostly from Machias. And he learns very quickly that the British are better at Indigenous negotiations than he has been, and that the Indigenous peoples that he thought might fight with him have struck their own deals with the Lieutenant Governor in Nova Scotia. So it's a story. It is a story of one of the sort of a lesser known invasion, the Siege of Fort Cumberland, but it's a very quick loss for John Allen, and demonstrates that the Indigenous peoples in the Northeast are very capable of picking the best side to support their needs.
Thank you. And we will end on this question. Can you speak to the formation of the 1st and 2nd Canadian regiments in the Continental Army?
I'm in the place that really focuses on military history, and I don't think I can. So my interest in the invasion of Canada was less about the military component. I can say, what few things I do know about this particular moment is the aftermath of the failed invasion of Quebec led to sort of a complication, which fits in I think in this building, whereas these Canadian regiments were not assigned to a state, they were assigned to Congress. So after the conflict ends, they start petitioning Congress. They want They want to benefit from their services. They hope to get land. Congress keeps passing them off onto states. New York has to try to situate a lot of them. But they are largely, they're stateless because they're a creation of Congress. And that leads to years of members of these regiments petitioning Congress for demands and redress for their participation, just as Loyalists who had moved to British provinces petitioned the British government for redress and to be made whole for all the things that they made up. So I don't think that's a satisfying answer, but there are a couple really good books that a quick Google search, I think, will help clarify. But I didn't write those ones, but they're very good.
Very good. Well, one more round of applause for Professor Lennox.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank you again for coming out and speaking for us this evening. If you are interested in purchasing a copy of his book, they are available in the back of the room here. So please see him afterwards. I'm sure he'll be happy to sign it for you as well. Thank you all again for coming and for your continued support of our mission. So we'll see you again next time. Thank you.